So following this talk, there will be an opportunity to talk to Dr. van den Bosch and ask her questions. Please submit your questions through the using the chat function. Ella will collect them for me, and I'll ask questions at the end on your behalf following the presentation. Now I'm going to introduce you, and I'm really delighted to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Matilda van den Bosch is a senior researcher at the Barcelona Institute of Global Health, and she's an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia. Her research lies in the interface of human health and the health of our natural surroundings, with the goal of contributing to urban policies that promote healthy environments for both humans and the ecosystems. Her work has contributed to policy making, and she has acted as an advisor on numerous international organizations, including the WHO, the UN Environmental Programme, and the US Environmental Protection Agency. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Matilda.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that kind introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me to giving this talk. Can you all hear me? It seems to work well. You can hear me. Okay, so I'll start sharing my screen, I guess. Right, so hello everyone, and welcome to this seminar, Healthy People in Healthy Environments, Moving Beyond Medicine. So as this talk is about the environment and medicine and the interactions between those two. So from pharmaceutical drugs to nature drugs, this is what I used to work with, pharmaceutical drugs, and then I went into a career or yes, where I started working with nature drugs, the salutogenic perspective on nature. Right, so what happened was that I started working in Sweden as a physician, so I have a medical background, and this is the beautiful University Hospital of Lund, and that's where I spent a few years working as a radiologist. I enjoyed working as a physician. However, there were also aspects of it that were relatively frustrating for me as well as for the patients, I think. What I'm talking about is that the kind of diseases that people suffer from mostly today are not perfectly suited for being taken care of within hospitals with pharmaceuticals or surgery or those kind of interventions. And that's because many diseases are related to lifestyles and the environment we live in. You know, we're talking chronic diseases like diabetes or mental health illness and those kind of things, cardiovascular diseases as well. And I perceived this frustration. I felt I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to sort of prevent people from coming to the hospital in the first place and try and keep people healthy to start with. And that's when I got interested in the research discipline of environmental psychology, and I started career track as a PhD student at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Sorry, something new. It's not working. So I got a PhD in landscape planning and public health, and since then I've been working as a researcher and not in the hospital anymore, and I have never regretted it. I feel because what I've been focusing on and what my colleagues that I'm working together with are focusing on is the health benefits from exposure to nature and contact with nature and seeing nature, listening to nature sounds and those sort of things. And from the knowledge that has accumulated over the year and the evidence that we have, the research that we have around this, is that we know by now that green spaces, nature is good for us. So I will try and walk you through a little bit about the evidence around nature and health associations. Now let me see. This is where I'm working today, the Barcelona Institute for Global Health. Well, this is the view from my window when I come in the morning. It's just on the Mediterranean Sea. So as you can see, I, at least personally, have made a nice move from the from the sort of dull hospital environment to first this beautiful castle campus in Sweden and now in Barcelona. So I don't complain, at least. So the outline of today's talk is that I want to talk a little bit about the global disease scenario and the relation to the changing environments. And then I want to discuss the pathways between urban green spaces and health, then touch upon the ecosystem services and impacts on human health, and then whether all this knowledge actually has an impact on policy and practice or not. Right, so the current disease scenario has changed quite a lot the last few decades. The WHO are making this kind of estimates based on what the disease scenario used to look like and what you can expect for the future. And this is also part of the Global Burden of Disease project. So what this slide shows is one of the estimates from WHO 2004. The most common diseases that people were suffering from globally were infections and then diarrheal diseases. You see already on place number 3, we have unipolar depressive disorder, simply depression. And then we move down the list. But this is the most important, the top listed diseases here. Because what is happening in 2030, there are not many years left to that. And I think we're actually already at this point in time. So what you see, it's increasing the mental health disorders. Depression is now on top of the list, and after that we have chronic heart diseases and road traffic accidents, stroke, and chronic lung diseases, respiratory diseases. All of these kind of chronic diseases are increasing while we're having a better hold of infectious diseases and diarrheal diseases, for example. Which is fantastic, of course. But the problem is that these sort of chronic diseases are increasing all over the world. So it's not only in Europe and North America, but also in Africa and India, for example. One of the most common diseases, reasons to die actually in India, is suicide. So the kind of lifestyles we are having in this part of the world are unfortunately exported to other parts of the world as well, as they get more and more urbanized and industrialized. So this is something that's interesting to think about, because many of these diseases are actually possible to prevent. They don't have to occur. There are ways to prevent depression, for example. There are ways to prevent obesity and chronic heart diseases. But once we've got them, they're fairly difficult to treat. So this sort of mirrors, that reflects the frustration I felt when working from the sort of bottom side of it all in the hospital, when there's not so much to do anymore. You can, of course, help the patients, but they're often difficult to treat, these kind of illnesses. So why do we suffer from these chronic diseases, the non-communicable disorders? We talk a lot about the risk factors in public health research. We talk about risk factors, and the main risk factors for illnesses, disorders today are stress, socioeconomic inequalities, urban living, physical inactivity, loneliness, and then today we also have a lot of impact from the climate change and harmful environmental exposures, such as air pollution, for example. And these are the risk factors. So from my perspective, if we can address the risk factors rather than the diseases, we have quite a lot to win. I will try to show you what I mean. So, for example, stress, it's a natural reaction. It's part of our biological systems. We are supposed to have this stress reaction when our bodily system gets aroused, but it's supposed to be a response to an acute stressor rather than a chronic stressor. Like during our evolutionary origin, we were exposed to this kind of stresses, like a lion or a tiger or something that was attacking us. And then it made sense to get these immediate acute stress reactions with an increase in heart rate and higher blood pressure to make us be able to run or fight or escape up in a tree or something. So what happens today when we get exactly the same biological stress reaction, which is characterized by, for example, higher cortisol levels, the stress hormone, and as I said, a higher pulse rate. And actually, so a lot of the energy that we have in our bodies when we are stressed, it goes from the brain to the muscles instead. So I don't know if you recognize it, but when you're stressed, your sort of thought process are not the most efficient, rarely the most constructive, but we tend to get into sort of negative mood spins that are not very constructive. So what happens is, what we talk a lot about is the coping strategies. When we are stressed for reasons like economic situations, family problems, job problems, and so on. We need to find a way to cope with this. And if the stress is not released by escaping from a lion, we need to do other things. And that we talk about coping. That could be, for example, physical activity. And also what I will come to then, it would be to go out in nature and interact with trees and so on. If we don't find a way to cope, we don't fight, we don't flight, and we don't cope. What happens is that we're not coping. And then we get these thought processes that I talked about. It becomes just worse and worse. And then we get more and more tired. The exhaustion syndrome we talk about. And then actually they can eventually lead to a proper disease that can be diagnosed, mental disease. There are also many of the other non-communicable diseases that are related to chronic stress. So you see what I mean? If we can prevent the stress, or if we rather can find ways to cope with it, we can prevent these diseases from occurring. Another risk factor I mentioned is the urbanization, the urban living. And of course, there are many good things with city living, the resources, their culture, their jobs, their education, and so on. However, there are some downsides to it as well, and we can talk about maybe later in the discussion what the reasons might be for why cities could be harmful to our health. We know from a lot of epidemiological studies, longitudinal studies, that living in cities is associated with a high risk of depression and schizophrenia. This has been demonstrated in a number of studies, so it seems to be that there is a causal effect. Actually, by living in a city, you have a high risk for developing a mental disorder. Can speculate, as I said, we can discuss this, but one of the theories is that it's much more stressful stimuli in a city compared to in the countryside. As I said, there are many epidemiological studies showing this, but then it's interesting because one has also seen actually with brain imaging techniques that there is a reflection of this association that we see between a high risk of depression and what's actually going on in the brain. So this is a German group of researchers led by Lederbogen, and they tested different populations. So they exposed people to a stress test, an acute social stress test, and then they investigated the reactions in the brain. All right, so that was the experiment. What they did was that they tested this for people who came either from the countryside, from small towns, or from a big city. And they looked at the specific parts of the brain, a little area called amygdala within the limbic system. And the limbic system is much related to our primary emotions and, for example, the stress reaction system can be reflected in here. And you can see, so after the stress test, there was no significant change in this area of the brain in the rural group, neither in the little town group. But those that came from a big city, who had either grown up in a big city or lived in a big city by now, they got a much stronger reaction. They got this lightening up of the stress system within the brain. So what that would mean is that they had less good capacity for cope with this acute stress reaction. So it seems like by coming from the countryside or living on the countryside, you have a stronger resilience against stress as such. So this is very interesting, I think, because this also tells us something about the biological impact of our environments. I talked about stress, urban living, and then also physical inactivity is one of the main risk factors. Whenever you go to the doctor, whatever public health official you talk to, they will tell you, be more physically active. That's the best thing you can do for your health. I'm not going to say that it's the best thing, but that it's a risk factor for basically everything, to be physically inactive. And so this is just a map of the prevalence of physical inactivity across the world. And some data you can trust, some not. But you see, of course, America, US is pretty high levels of physical inactivity, between 30 and 40%. The same goes for UK, I'm afraid. Sweden is a little bit better. Spain, where I'm living now, we're not doing well. And then Saudi Arabia, the Middle East here is coming up high, mostly determined by cultural factors, and also what is often ascribed to is the differences between gender, and that women often have to stay at home and not move around so much in these countries. Okay, and then this sort of corresponds very, very strongly to the levels of obesity as well, and that is a very strong risk factor for different diseases, and not the least for dying. We know that obesity is a risk factor for dying early, for premature mortality. Okay, stress, urban living, physical inactivity, and then loneliness and social isolation. This is interesting, I think, from the point of view that it's difficult to analyze specifically what is loneliness. How do you define that? What is social isolation? So therefore, I'm impressed by researchers who manages to do that, and there are various ways, of course, but it's sort of a complex concept. However, Christine Holt-Lundstad and her colleagues published a study in 2015 where they found the results from this study showed that it's actually more dangerous to health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, to be lonely, to not have any social contacts. That's what we talk a lot about, the community, feeling of community, being part of a choir, or being part of taking in your neighborhood, and having this sort of connection feeling to people around you is very, very important. And loneliness increases the risk of many of these non-communicable chronic diseases I already mentioned: heart diseases, stroke, dementia, and so on. The same thing, paradoxically, loneliness and social isolation tend to be more common in big cities. I say paradoxically because in cities we have many more people, and the population density is much higher. But maybe something with the environment is not really stimulating to social interactions. Okay. All right, so what does all of this I've been talking about, these risk factors, what does this have to do with natural environments, which is what I wanted to talk about mostly? Well, so the research that has been done, the findings, and I talk about research because that is my job, but I'm pretty sure that many of you would recognize this just without, you don't have to read about it really. I think many of us would recognize, yeah, of course it's good to be in nature. And of course it's good for your health. Many people say that to me, but why do you do research on that? That's common sense, right? However, it's common sense, yes, but it doesn't have much of an implementation, not enough implementation in our policies and how we actually deal with health and disease. So that is why I find it interesting and stimulating to do research on it. Okay, so there's a lot of research, there are many studies, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that natural environments does have an impact on health and well-being, different aspects of that. And of course, we're interested in why is this so? Why is there a connection? Is there something magical around trees? Is there some sort of particles that are emitted? Well, could be. I'm not saying that it's not, but what we often talk about is that there are different pathways. This becomes a little bit of a complex picture, but I will try to walk you through it. And it relates very much to what I've been talking about already. So there is research showing that natural environments reduces stress. Obviously, you need to have contact with nature. There's also research that shows that having nature in your neighborhood stimulates social interactions. Greener neighborhood, people tend to be more physically active. And then we have the ecosystem services. As you know, there are 4 different types of ecosystems, 4 bigger groups. And from my perspective, especially in cities, the natural green spaces are mostly the most important for health in that context are the regulating ecosystem services, mitigating climate change impacts, for example, and the cooling effect, I think, is very important. So there's a lot of research, at least, suggesting that it has a direct impact on health through that pathway. Of course, we have these pathways: physical activity, social contact, stress reduction. All of those are related to health and well-being, and these are risk factors. If we don't have those, there are risk factors for disease, as I previously went through. All right, so I said that there's a lot of research, so I want to try to show you a little bit, a few examples of the studies that have been conducted around these outcomes and around the pathways. So I talked about stress and mental health, study by Ian Alcock and his colleagues in UK. It's conducted through they're affiliated to the University of Exeter, but this is actually the I think it's the larger UK household panel study. Anyhow, what they looked at, what they had this good material, so they could follow people over several years and look at them whether they were moving or not. And they looked at people who had moved to a greener area. So you see here at time point 1, and then if they move to a greener area, their mental health at a higher level. And on the other hand, if you move to a less green area, your mental health is decreasing, is getting less good, and then it goes up to baseline again, and but it doesn't really get better, obviously. I was at the department when they were conducting this analysis. I was visiting at the university, and the worst thing you can do for mental health is surprising and also a little bit paradoxical, but the worst thing you can do, you might not guess, but that is not to get married, but it is to get kids. Actually, your mental well-being decreases and it remains low. And I'm always so surprised when I think about this and read about this, because I love my 3 kids and they brought me so much joy. But the one thing I think is maybe you tend to be continuously anxious, and that might have a bad impact on your mental health. I think the story is more complex than that, but this is what I found in the study. Anyhow, as you might or will notice, is that I'm interested quite a lot in the biological mechanisms that could have something to do. Well, I think many of us are interested in why do we have these associations between green spaces and health. Greg Bratman is a colleague from the University of Washington, and he conducted together with his colleagues experimental studies in 2015. They got it published in 2015. So they had 2 groups of people who were dysthymic, a little bit depressed, and they were all ruminating. They had this symptom, depression, which is rumination, which means basically that, like I mentioned before, you get stuck in these negative thought spins. I'm sure you recognize it. We all have it so now and then. But if you have a tendency towards depression, you're ruminating more. Okay. So this group of people were suffering from this rumination symptom. And they were in this experiment, and one part of the group went for a walk in nature in a park, and the other group went for a walk in a built-up setting. And they asked them about the rumination symptoms before and after the walks. And you can see, so this figure shows about the questions, all right? So in the nature group, they said that they actually had a decrease. They had decreased, the rumination thoughts were decreasing, they felt a little bit better, while there was no such change at all in the group that went into the urban built-up environment. However, Greg Bratman was, like myself, also interested in looking a little bit more into the mechanistic pathways. So they also used the brain imaging technique and looked at another little area here in the prefrontal cortex, which happens to be it's fascinating with the brain, but there's so many different very specific areas that are activated depending on what mood state we are in or whatever we are doing and thinking and behaving. So in this prefrontal cortex area we can call it the rumination area. So that one lightens up when you are ruminating. And so this was before the walk, actually. And after the walk in the nature group, you see a significant decrease in the lightening up of this little area in the brain, while you don't see any change in the urban group area, but they still have this lightening up of the prefrontal cortex, rumination area of the brain. Right, so you see there's correspondence between what the participants say, okay, I feel better, I'm ruminating less, and this actually also reflected in the brain. Quite fascinating, I think. All right, the social isolation aspect and the social cohesion aspect of green spaces is another thing that is a little bit more difficult to study objectively, not less important for us at all. As I said, social isolation is the main risk factor. Birgit Elands and her colleagues have been working a lot around this, done really important work on the social cohesion aspects of urban green spaces. And they have presented this model, which basically tells us that, of course, depending on the type of green space and whether people actually go outside, we get different impacts. But if there is a type of green space that stimulates people to go outside. They get this free democratic space to be in social interaction with others. And the good thing I find with urban green spaces is that it's free, it's democratic, and also you can be in the setting in the park without actually, you don't necessarily have to interact with other people, but it's enough to see other people around in a sort of soothing setting, and you can watch other people having a picnic or whatever, and you can feel, because it's not a demanding setting, you can sort of feel that you are part of the bigger context anyhow. So you perceive a social cohesion, which then has a positive impact on your mental health. This is a sort of landmark study. It was published in 2008, but I can't resist to cite it or present it because it's so beautifully designed and it's such beautiful results. It's again from UK, Richard Mitchell and Popham published it in the Lancet, and it's a fairly large sample of 40 million English people. And they basically studied people of different income, and they categorized them in accordance with how much green there was around their residence. So what you see with the different blue bars here are different people of different income level, and on this axis you see the risk of dying. Okay, and we know that high income or low income is associated with a higher risk of dying early. We will all die, I promise you, but dying early, premature mortality is what we are talking about. So if you are wealthy, have a good education, you will live longer. That is the sad facts, or the sad facts. All right, so in these blue bars, you see the people of high income are those to the leftist, and those of the lower income are to the right, is the darker blue. All right, so just focus on this part of the diagram. So in the areas where there's no green, there's a large gap in the risk of dying early between those of high income and those of low income. So you're almost 2 times a higher risk of dying early if you're in the low income group. And then if you move along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, towards areas with more green, you see that in this part of the diagram, the risk of dying is much more, dying early is much more similar between the groups. What this graph tells you in total is that there seems to be some buffering effect with green spaces, which buffers, dilutes the socioeconomically related inequalities in terms of health, which is super important because this tells us that we need to invest in green infrastructures in the areas where it is needed the most, meaning in areas of deprivation in our cities. That is where politicians and planners and the rest of us need to focus if we want to have a real impact on health for everyone. I thought I was just going to touch upon this study that was published last week. It was my PhD student, Ingrid Jarvis. So we did some work who was the first author. She has been conducting the analysis for the study. We conducted it in Metro Vancouver in Canada, and we were looking at childhood development, because from previous literature, we know that green spaces seem to promote childhood mental well-being and childhood development. It improves the cognitive skills, improve academic performance, and so on. So we decided that we wanted to study this, and yeah, I just had this slightly boring table and now I can't perfectly see it either. Right, so what we were interested in was not only whether there was an association between green spaces and the children's development, but also, again, we wanted to figure out why is this so? Why is there an impact of green spaces on childhood development? Because that we found, okay, the children who had more green spaces in their living environments also had a better development as we measured with a standardized scale. What we also had access to was estimates of air pollution, NO2 and PM2.5, and also noise. And in this mediation model, what you can basically see is the percentage of the effect between green spaces and childhood development that is explained by the mediator. And what this tells us is that the green space reduction effect in NO2 is really large, which means that the reason why children living in green spaces, the reason for why they are have a better chances of a good development is because the trees reduce the NO2, and also that the emission factors of air pollution are lower, of course, in green areas. But you can see that also the reduction of noise is important for the childhood development aspect. I said it was published last week, so I thought I'd just put it up there, and you have the link as well if you're interested to find it on the web. Physical activity in green spaces, not only, yes, I was going to show that one first, actually. This is by Thomas Astelbert and his colleagues in Australia, where they looked again. This is a similar kind of graph. Many of those epidemiological studies use these graphs. So this is the risk, we talk about the risk, but this is the chance of being physically active. And again, on the horizontal axis, you have the levels of green space. And to make a long story shorter, we can basically see that the chances of being physically active are much higher if you live in a green area. Please send me questions later on, or we can discuss it more, because it doesn't make too much sense to go into the details. So you will just have to trust me when I say that this is what we see from the graph. I just wanted to mention as well, Richard Mitchell is doing a lot of important work on this, because it's not only that the green spaces actually stimulate people to being outdoors and being physically active, but it's also the beneficial effects of physical activity on mental health. That's something we know about from just being at the gym, for example. You get a better mental health as well. However, if you do this physical activity outdoors, the impact on your mental health is even better. So you get a good mental health effect by being physically active, but if you really want to boost it, then you should do the same physical activity, but outdoors. Okay. Right, so social cohesion, I said that before, it's difficult to study, but one way to do it is by asking people where they make friends. So this is a study where they ask people what kind of things they did if they wanted to meet new friends and make more social contacts. And this is just showing the results that the most common, the most popular thing to do for getting more friends was to be outdoors in parks, playgrounds, and so on. And this is, they were asking young people, and this is they're asking people who lived in Switzerland, who were residents of Switzerland, and then newcomers who had recently moved to Switzerland. So you see, for newcomers, this seems to be the most important thing. It's like by far the most popular thing to do to get more social contacts in comparison to going to the cinema, sports events, internet, and so on. Yes, the immune system does something. Sorry, I'm just checking the time where I'm at. It seems to be fine. The immune system function, I'm smiling because it's something I'm getting more and more interested in with time, because there are a few new studies coming that shows that the exposure to microorganisms from soil has a direct impact on the gut microbiome, the bacteria we have in our guts, and this impact. All right, so in modern living, the microbiome of our guts is actually disturbed. We are supposed to interact with nature. We are supposed to interact with the soil and microorganisms and so on. And because we are deprived of that in built-up settings and in cities, the development of our microbiome within the gut is impacted in a negative way. We need a diversity. We need diversity in nature. We need biodiversity. We actually need this diversity inside ourselves as well. So we need a diverse set of bacteria in our guts. And the lack of diversity in our guts has a tremendous impact on many diseases like immune system disorders, inflammatory diseases, and actually mental health as well, something I'm specifically interested in. A few studies show that if you expose children, for example, to microorganisms in soil, you can measure bacteria in the gut and see that they actually get an impact, and you get a higher diversity in the gut. And some studies also show that this is also related to inflammatory markers, biomarkers in blood that you can measure. So you see that it does have an impact on the immune system as well. This is very recent research, but I'm pretty sure more will come around that. It's a fascinating area. This is just a think if this presentation will be shared, you can find these links and read more if you're interested. I just wanted to show you that there is a lot of evidence on this. This is just a collection from, listed a few recent studies from 2020 showing that there is an effect. This is, I picked a few quite good studies. They're well conducted. There is an impact on air pollution and heat reduction. There is an impact on the immune system, and even epigenetics and telomere length, which has to do with the aging. People age less, we live longer if we live in green areas, and also the climate change mitigation, the carbon sink, the direct carbon sink from trees. And hey, this list is growing by every day. This is the evidence. These are studies showing different health outcomes. And as I said, it's growing every day. I cannot keep track of it anymore. Well, I can't update my slides at least, because they would take me all day. Right, so sleep quality, asthma, schizophrenia, memory, dementia, and stroke, and congenital heart effects, everything basically has an association to green spaces, and there seems to be a beneficial impact and the reduced risk of many of these diseases in areas where there is more green. And the ecosystem services I already mentioned. From an urban perspective, as I said, the climate regulation and the heat reduction are very important from a health perspective, and of course the cultural ecosystem services. But for me, all those pathways I've been talking about, stress reduction, physical activity, and social cohesion, sort of are sorting under this cultural ecosystem services concept. I feel that I should hurry up a little bit. I just wanted to show this slide as well, because one of the strongest evidences we have is for heat reduction, and I wanted to bring that up because heat stress, and I mean, this is every summer we see these new records, and every summer they say this is the hottest summer on records, and this is strongly related to an increased risk, an increased mortality, and many different diseases. And it's also, unfortunately, among children, we also see impact on their cognitive development by exposure to extreme heat, and pregnant women as well. The birth outcomes are also impacted by heat exposure. So therefore, if we can reduce the heat by having more trees in our cities, there's a lot to win. Right, let me finally touch a little bit upon whether we managed to translate. I've been throwing all these studies and evidence and science and research, and you feel that this should be an easy thing to sell, right? Unfortunately, it's not so easy. The communication from science to policy and practice is not always perfect. There's an interesting, quite a few studies showing that. So, for example, the ecosystem services, the scientific knowledge about this continues to have limited impact on policy and decision. And the ecosystem services concept is well-founded, and it has been around since 2005, at least, with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment reports. So we know a lot about this, but still it has a relatively poor impact on policy and decision. And this, as a result, we see that the urban tree canopy is declining, and the green planning, especially in rapidly urbanizing countries, is not following, sort of following the same patterns as we did, making the same mistakes as we did when we urbanized our countries and cities. A colleague of mine, Mark Nieuwenhuizen, and myself published a study a few years ago where we tried to look into this, the reasons for why the science is not perfectly translated. So we reviewed the literature on this and came up with a few suggestions. Why do we fail? We're talking about cognitive bias, different languages, unbalanced messages, and competing interests. I will quickly try to explain what I mean with this. So the cognitive bias is simply that this thing with green spaces and health is not really part of the normative agenda. This is not what has been usually talked about in policy and practice, and this has a tendency towards more technological solutions and quick fix to start implementing nature and as a solution to our different problems has until recently not been really part of it. There's a lot of hope, there's a lot of optimism behind this actually, because now we're talking quite a lot about nature-based solutions. It's coming into the EU language and so on, that we just need to keep the momentum on this. Talking about that is coming into the EU language, we do speak different languages. Researchers speak a different language than practitioners, and the researchers from different disciplines speak different languages. And one of the things I usually like to refer to is the fact how we always end our studies. When we publish a study and we end the article with saying, yeah, okay, so this study showed this and that, but we need more research, we need more studies on this before we can actually do anything. This is the way we have to study. This is this is the kind of language we sort of have to use from a scientific, ethical integrity perspective. However, if we want to translate our message that green is good, right? Sometimes I feel, okay, green is good. Can we please implement it? Air pollution is bad. Regulate air pollution. It's not more difficult than that. Okay. I'm talking now not as a scientist, right? Have that clear. I just think we need to learn to speak a little bit better in between us and understand why there is a point with the scientific integrity, and also understand why it's important to communicate the real benefits to have an impact. We talk also about, we found this thing with unbalanced messages, the risks, for example. We know that children of today are not allowed to climb trees to the same extent. They're not allowed to move around in the neighborhood to the same extent, because we have a perception of risks. Parents, teachers, and so on. There is this feeling of, oh, they can fall down from the tree, so it's better we keep them out of the tree. But while the risks of the physical inactivity then is actually much worse for their health than the risk of them falling from the tree and hurting themselves. And then, of course, the budgets, the competing interests, especially in densifying cities, that is a real problem. How do we do? We need to densify our cities, more people are moving in, and how do we at the same time keep the green or even increase the green spaces? That is a dilemma. That is a complicated question where I again think we need to work much more together to find clever solutions for this, because I'm convinced that there are solutions. All right. Again, ending on a positive note, this is now a few years old already, this review that WHO published on urban green spaces and health. What I mainly want to communicate is that, yes, it is coming. EU is picking it up, nature-based solutions, and the World Health Organization, the main organ for health today in the world, is actually considering clearly in all their statements today that the urban green spaces, that is a health asset. That is something that's really important to consider and implement if we want to have good public health across the globe. And more positive news about all the books that are published. Again, it's happening not every day maybe, but new books are coming all the time. So if you're interested in this topic, there's so much to read. The Nature Fix, for example, by Florence Williams. And this is a textbook that myself and my colleague William Bird edited and published a few years ago. I just quickly want to mention as well an Erasmus project that I'm part of, the Green for Care. I strongly suggest you to go into the website, because it's interesting looking at entrepreneurship and ways to promote business and non-profit actions within the green care agenda. And it's urban green space, but also forest therapy, green tourism, and so on, and also education around this. So if you're interested in this, please visit the website. Thanks a lot for your attention. Sorry for speaking a bit fast by the end. Okay, I'm ready for your questions. Shall I start sharing?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you could, that'd be great. Thank you, Matilda. Right. Well, there's been a fairly active discussion in the, need my specs, hang on a second, folks, in the chat here. And I think there's some questions about, right at the very beginning, about what do we mean by green spaces? Are there, I think, was it Sue asked, are there sizes of green area that are more beneficial? Somebody, I think, if I caught it right, was asking about, does the green space need to be a diverse space? So do you need biodiversity, sorry, in that? So if I take that first question from Sue, if I can, Matilda, is there a sort of optimal size, or is it that we just need green spaces around us at all times?
Right, no, that's a good question. And I realized when you said what is a green space, that's obviously something I should have defined to start with. But the question as such, well, okay, so green spaces, when we talk about it, usually when we talk about the urban green spaces, it's parks, it's street trees, it's lawns, it's pocket parks, and so on. from my perspective, I tend to call it, try to call it natural spaces or natural environments, because I would include also blue spaces, anything that has a natural element within it. For all of these questions, I could answer many of these questions with the same with the same response. It depends on what kind of health outcome you're interested in, right? So if you're interested in the pathway of physical activity, you would naturally need a fairly large green space, a park to run around in or be physically active in. Having said that, though, green street trees there's not much research done on that, but I could imagine, hypothetically, it could promote physical activity by the shade, for example. It's easy to walk fast or even run along a street if there's trees that shade and make it more comfortable to run and be physically active. For the WHO made this WHO made the guidelines, actually. So we worked on an urban green space indicator where we suggested that in order to call it like a healthy green city, people should have access to 1 hectare size, at least, green space within 300 meters of their residence. So in that one, we defined it as if it should be at least 1 hectare for having a health benefit. There's no real evidence for this, and mostly because it's so complex, because it has to do with the health impact we're interested in. And that goes the same for the biodiversity. I mentioned already the soil, the microorganism biodiversity is important if you're looking at the immune system pathway. The soil microorganism biodiversity is related also to plant diversity, depending on many different complex factors that I don't know enough about at the top of my head. However, diversity is important, the soil biodiversity, and then if you look at the general biodiversity, like from different flowers, different colors of the trees, different species and so on, I think for me, I would assume that it has an impact on the sort of stress relief as well, or how you... It's a perception of the landscape, right? It's that has also an impact on our well-being and our behavior and those kind of things. But it all depends on what pathway, what health outcome you're interested in. And there's not much studies looking at the. There are a few new studies coming out looking at whether there are different types of green spaces that are more beneficial than others. We actually conducted one back in Vancouver, where we found that trees, specifically deciduous trees, were more beneficial for the perception, your perception of general health in comparison to grass, for example. But there's much more research is needed on that. Okay.
I think I've captured the sort of planning questions there, or you've answered most of them. Please, if anybody feels we haven't, jab something into the chat right now. But I was thinking actually of a sort of experiment, if you like, that's happened in the last couple of years, which is COVID. So during COVID, people were restricted from their green spaces. And this is where I'm thinking of the biodiversity angle. I can't remember who raised that in the chat, but during COVID, we were not exposed. So everybody knows, I hope everybody knows, I'm a microbiologist, so hence my angle on this one. But we were restricted from being exposed, and your immune system is exposed to allergens by your mucosal surfaces. So you're absolutely right. You know, the gut's a major one, and that's how we pick up all those pathogens and all those organisms, and we make our microbiome as diverse as it is. However, we also breathe things in, and what we're seeing now is post-pandemic a huge rise in respiratory pathogens because we have not developed the natural immunity to them that we would ordinarily have. And I just wonder whether we know there's a link, don't we, between microbiome and mental health. So a good, healthy microbiome feeds back into a healthy mental health. And I just wonder if at the end of the day, having a diverse environment, having a green environment, a healthy environment where the animals are healthy, the environment around you feeds directly back into us as just beings in that environment. It's a bit of a large leap, but I wonder if you could comment on that. So perhaps it's really, really vital that environment around us isn't just the 330-300, but is a very mixed and supports all the life forms and that you might want in that environment. So it's no good having, you know, 3 trees near you if those trees aren't different trees and shedding pollen at different times, housing different organisms. I don't know.
Yes, sorry, I'm not entirely sure what to comment. I agree with you. For the having 3 trees in your immediate, I think it's better than no trees. Okay, and when it comes to the allergy perspectives, that's from a more like a planning perspective. There are ways to plan to maintain trees so they don't actually emit allergenic pollens. And for that, I think what you're tapping into a little bit is, for me, what stimulates me a lot is the connection. You say the healthy environment, exactly, which needs to be biodiversity. Biodiversity is the fundament for all the ecosystem services, right? Without biodiversity, the environments, we already see that the environment, the environmental degradation, right, and the extinction of species, and so. And ecologists have known this for years and years, right? So for me, coming from a medical perspective, it's just interesting that finally, after all these years, we're starting to catch up with the ecologists, the ecology knowledge, right? And realizing that there is a strong interdependence between the health of the environment and the health of human beings. And in the bottom of all this, we have the biodiversity. Right now, I don't know at all if I answered or commented on what you wanted me to comment on. But
no, I did. I think you did, Matilda. I think you were expressing that you need that biodiversity. Just a quick one here again from Sue. Does this mean that do we have in urban areas a conflict with land value? Is that what you see? So do we need to be able to sort of put a number on it? Should we add a health value to trees? And, you know, when we're balancing out, the land is worth this much. However, the health value here is worth much more.
Yes, another interesting question. Well, it's all interesting questions, so I shouldn't say that, because I think I always get interesting questions. It's an interesting point, and it often comes up. There is projects around this. The Natural Capital, for example, project from Stanford University. They're doing exactly this sort of cost benefits analysis, and it's hard to put. There's so many values to a tree, right? Which is not just monetary. So having said that for me, a tree is worth very much more than it's worth in money. The point with putting a monetary value on it is that it's, again, a way to communicate. It's a way to translate the health benefits, the softer values, into real action. And as we said, there are vested interests. We are competing about for land. And if we know that, okay, if we plant this and this amount of trees, we will have this and this health outcomes, which translates into savings, then we can make this trade-off calculations, right? That this trees are probably in 10 years time, we will have paid for the supermarket or the mall or whatever you were otherwise planning to have in this area. So taking it further, I think it has some sort of value. And there are a few cost efficiency and cost benefit analysis looking into this, which actually shows that, yeah, by reducing the mortality, we save this and this amount of money. So there is something behind that.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Has anybody got anything else? If not, I don't think I've missed anything, have I? So Ella's already putting we're about to turn this off notice on. She's very efficient, you know, everybody. So she's thanking everybody for the questions and for participating as ever in this talk. And thank you, Matilda, for a really fascinating talk. It was lovely to think about the connections there, and also to, you know, we're building and planning on site. So these are very important messages for the college as well, and in a more immediate setting. So anybody else got anything else? I think yeah, we can all do a virtual round of applause for Matilda. That would be very much appreciated, or a loud and noisy one. That's also appreciated too. But thank you, Matilda, very, very much for your talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
Pleasure.
Thank you.